Hello and welcome to the National Resource Center. This is Pegu. I am an associate professor in the Department of Mass Communication and Journalism, Tezpur University. This module discusses the basic concept and the theoretical approaches in understanding the process of acculturation. The primary concept of acculturation revolves around change that is brought in one's culture as a result of contact with the host culture. Sociocultural plurality is one of the chief characteristics of many societies all over the world today. Such interactions and intermixing among the various groups that live together in a society over the years give rise to the process of acculturation, wherein a person or a group belonging to a particular culture acquire or borrow certain traits from another culture. This often causes changes in the sociocultural setup of the groups, with patterns of changes that are discernible in one's customs, religious practices, dietary habits, dressing patterns, and modes of communication. Considerably, the process of acculturation deals with all such changes in the cultural as well as psychological behavior of an individual or the whole group. The process of migration, sociocultural mobility, and acculturative changes are ubiquitous sociocultural processes occurring worldwide. Historically, the process of sociocultural contact, interaction, and intermixing among the members of the various cultural groups is not a new phenomenon. In fact, sociocultural plurality is one of the chief characteristics of many societies all over the world today. It is generally perceived that during the process of acculturation, the flow of cultural values and practices usually takes place from the dominant group or host culture to the minority culture or group. However, there are cases where the dominant culture could be seen to acquire certain traits of the lesser dominant groups. Sometimes, acculturation also leads to displacement or even extinction of the minority culture. Now we need to understand culture before understanding acculturation. The base word of acculturation is culture. Culture simply means a way of living and a way of life. Culture means that there are certain ways and reasons in which individuals and group of people speak, conduct themselves, celebrate holidays, and express their belief systems. As you can imagine, there is a tremendous diversity of cultures around the world. India, as we know, is a mosaic of cultural diversities. While discussing on culture, we can break down the latter geographical areas into smaller regions. For example, if you are asked to discuss on Indian culture, you might explain that there is a difference between those living in the south versus those living in the northeast, for example. Perhaps a difference might be in the food that people eat, the clothes people wear, or the customs and activities that they participate in. Understanding the term culture can lead us to more fully understand the terms associated with acculturation. So what does acculturation mean? When individuals or groups of people transition from living a lifestyle of their own culture to moving into a lifestyle of another culture, they must acculturate or come to adopt the new culture's behaviors, values, customs, and language. The word acculturation is the act of that transition. Let me now give you a brief historical overview of the concept of acculturation. The concept of acculturation was conceived in the fields of anthropology and sociology early in the 20th century. It has been used to explain the dynamics involved when people from diverse cultural backgrounds comes into continuous contact with one another. The phrase acculturation was initially coined by anthropologists in the late 1930s. Its definition was later refined by various entities such as the Social Science Research Council in 1954, as well as various other fields such as psychology. Different researchers such as Graves have additionally made further distinction, passing acculturation into two types. Number one, acculturation on a population level, and number two, acculturation on an individual level. The latter is known as psychological acculturation. Now, what is acculturation? Acculturation is the dual process of cultural and psychological change that takes place as a result of contact between two or more cultural groups and their individual members. At an individual level, it causes change in a person's attitude and behavior. At a broader scale or at group level, acculturation involves changes in collective activities, social institutions, and setups, as well as cultural practices. During acculturation, the flow of cultural values and practices usually takes place from the dominant group or host culture to the minority culture. There are cases where a dominant culture could be seen to acquire certain traits of the lesser dominant groups. Sometimes, acculturation also leads to displacement or even extinction of the minority culture. Thus, we understand that acculturation comprehends those phenomena which result when groups of individuals having different cultures come into continuous first-hand contact with subsequent changes in the original cultural patterns of either or both groups. Interestingly, Hofstede compares culture as a software of the mind, reflecting specific patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. Hofstede's definition reads as, culture is always a collective phenomena because it is at least partly shared with people who live or lived within the same social environment, which is where it was learned. Culture consists of the unwritten rules of the social game. It is the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the members of one group or category of people from others. The concept of acculturation has been studied scientifically since 1918. As it has been approached at different times from the fields of psychology, anthropology, and sociology, numerous theories and definitions have emerged to describe elements of the acculturative process. Despite definitions and evidence that acculturation entails a two-way process of change, research and theory have primarily focused on the adjustments and adaptations made by minorities such as immigrants, refugees, and indigenous peoples in response to their contact with the dominant majority. Contemporary research has primarily focused on different strategies of acculturation and how variations in acculturation affect how well individuals adapt to their society. Acculturation is defined as the changes that take place when two cultures come into continuous first-hand contact. The concept of acculturation, conceived in the fields of anthropology and sociology as early as 1880, but the earliest classical formulation comes from Redfield, Linton, and Herkovitz. Let us examine some more definitions on acculturation. The Social Science Research Council defines acculturation as a cultural change initiated by the conjunction of two or more autonomous cultural systems. According to Redfield, Linton, and Herkovitz, acculturation comprehends those phenomena which result when groups of individuals having different cultures come into continuous first-hand contact with subsequent changes in the original cultural patterns of either or both groups. Robert Winthrop asserts that acculturation is a process of systematic cultural change of a particular society carried out by an alien dominant society. The process of acculturation has been explained and analyzed by scholars such as Mead Margaret, M.J. Herkovitz, and Robert Redfield, using the concept of dominant and weak cultures, as well little and great traditions. As interpreted by these scholars, due to the contact between the dominant and the weak culture, the sociocultural life, particularly the religious practices and traditional lifestyles of the latter, gets disorganized, which creates marginality amongst the members of the weak culture. Again, according to Redfield, acculturation caused as a result of interaction between little traditions and great traditions, breaks the isolation, self-sufficiency and homogeneous nature of the little community. By little traditions, Redfield meant the tribal and peasant societies, and by great traditions, the scholar unequivocally meant languages, religion and customs of the dominant culture or the elite community. In this section, we will try to understand John Berry's conceptual framework in understanding acculturation. Although numerous models of acculturation exist, the most complete model take into consideration the changes occurring at the group and individual levels of both interacting groups. To understand acculturation at the group level, one must first look at the nature of both cultures before coming into contact with one another. A useful approach is John Berry's conceptual framework. As you are seeing it on the slides, Berry's conceptual framework has 4 quadrants, and each of these quadrants you have F and C, where F stands for first culture and C stands for contact culture. In the first quadrant, it is represented as -F plus C, where first culture is abundant and the contact culture is favored. This is called as assimilation. And in the second quadrant, it is represented as +F and -C, where first culture continues and the contact culture is disfavored. This is called as rejection. And in the third quadrant, it is represented by +F plus C, where both first and contact culture are favored. This is called as integration. And in the last quadrant, it is represented as -F minus C, where both the first and the contact culture are disfavored. This is called as deculturation. I suppose we have understood the basic concepts of acculturation. In this section, I shall talk about acculturation and assimilation. While defining and understanding the concept of acculturation, it is also necessary to mark a distinction between acculturation and assimilation. There is a clear distinction between acculturation and assimilation. Redfield, Linton and Herkovitz, whose definitions of acculturation mark a distinction between acculturation and assimilation, consider assimilation at times to be a phase of acculturation. These scholars perceive the process of acculturation to be those phenomena which result when groups of individuals having different cultures come into continuous first-hand contact with subsequent changes in the original cultural patterns of either or both groups. However, there are many others who tend to use the terms interchangeably. Assimilation implies that the subordinate groups actually accepts and internalize the values and culture of the group. Assimilation, on the other hand, is a cultural, social and psychological phenomena. According to Park and Burgess, assimilation is a process of interpretation and fusion in which persons and groups acquire the memories, sentiments, attitudes of other persons or groups, and by sharing their experiences and history are incorporated with them in a cultural life. Ogburn and Nimkov write, assimilation is the process whereby individuals or groups once dissimilar become similar, that is, become identified in their interests and outlooks. Horton and Hunt in 1964 define it as the process of mutual cultural diffusion through which persons and groups become culturally alike. According to Schaeffer and Lamb, assimilation is the process by which a person forsakes his or her own cultural tradition to become part of a different culture. Summarizing the above views, it may be said that assimilation is a process of fusion or blending, whereby cultural differences tend to disappear and individuals and groups once dissimilar become similar. It results in the modification of attitudes, values, patterns of thinking and ultimately behavior. Husbands and wives after marriage with dissimilar backgrounds, often develop a surprising unity of interest and purpose. In the long run, they become more or less similar in their attitude towards life and family. If we look at more recent studies, it could be seen that due to increased global migration, there has been an increased use of new terms such as biculturalism, multiculturalism, integration, and globalization. These terms have either been used interchangeably with acculturation or as an alternate of each other. Regardless of this, there has been an increasing tendency across the academia for preferring acculturation over assimilation. One of the reasons for such preference might be that the process of acculturation takes into account the fact that when individuals or groups enter into intercultural contact, there is always reciprocity of influences that the cultural groups have on each other during acculturation. Researchers have also shown that due to intercultural changes, the lesser dominant culture has the chances of getting displaced or extinct. However, it does not necessarily mean that the process of acculturation has to replace the indigenous culture in entirety. Many studies on communities undergoing the process of acculturation would bring into light elements of sociocultural linguistic syncretism, which concepts such as multiculturalism, biculturalism coming into the forefront. For instance, the missing community of Assam, which is one of the largest ethnic groups of Assam, has undergone tremendous acculturation over a long period of time. The community has undergone changes in their dressing patterns, dietary habits, religious beliefs and practices, as well as the communication system. However, a great deal of their original cultural, linguistic and religious elements are still pervasive among the community, especially in the rural areas. The Missings continued their first culture and favor the contact culture as well, which suggests sociocultural linguistic syncretism working at par among the members of the community. It will be reasonable if we close this subsection with a quotation of Dennis O'Neill, who asserts, "There often is a syncretism or an amalgamation of traditional and introduced traits. The new traits may be blended with or worked into the indigenous culture to make them more acceptable." I shall now discuss on adaptation and acculturation. We need to understand two pertinent questions. What is adaptation and what causes adaptation? Adaptation is considered as a sequence of acculturation, that is, the changes that are caused in a person's behavioral repertoire as a result of the process of acculturation. Contact and change in culturally plural societies occur for a number of reasons, such as colonization, military invasions, migrations, which involves socioeconomic necessities. This leads to some long-term adaptations. This results in some form of extended accommodations among the various individuals or groups that are in contact. For example, learning each other's languages, mutual sharing and adopting of food preferences, dressing patterns and sociocultural practices that characterizes each groups. Sometimes adaptations and accommodations that acculturation causes take place in a peaceful way through the process of culture shedding and culture learning. For instance, the various ethnic communities that share the same sociocultural space. In some situations, intercultural exchanges may also result in culture conflict and acculturative stresses. In case of various immigrants groups, interactions and adaptations cause a good amount of acculturative stress. In this section, I shall talk on how people acculturate. Let me explain the process in which people acculturate. This includes two processes. A. The process of contacts between different cultures, B. The process which includes the outcome of such contacts. The process of contact among different cultures may take place through two methods. Direct method. In direct method, acculturation involves direct social interaction. In indirect method, acculturation involves exposure to other cultures by means of the mass media of communication. The situation in which acculturation occurs are as follows. 1. Situation where elements of culture are forced on a people or where acceptance is voluntary. 2. Situation where social or political inequalities exist between groups. 3. In the third situation, three alternatives are presented. They are where there is a political dominance but not social, where dominance is both political and social, and where social superiority of one group over another is recognized without political dominance. In the process of acculturation, the borrowed element is always merged with what was present before the contact. As a result, a culture of multiple origins is emerged. So, it is believed that the dynamics of acculturation are also creative. If anybody wants to find out the result of acculturation by tracing traits to their origin, it is very difficult. Studies on acculturation strategies have brought into focus two pertinent issues. 1. The degree to which people wish to maintain their cultural heritage, and the degree to which people wish to have contact with those who are outside their group. Preferences with respect to these two issues lead to the adoption of four different acculturation strategies. 1. Assimilation. 2. Integration. 3. Separation. And 4. Marginalization. The assimilation strategy is used when individuals do not wish to maintain their cultural identity and seek close interaction with other cultures. The separation strategy is defined by individuals who place a high value on holding onto their original culture and avoid interaction with members of the new society. The integration strategy is used by individuals with an interest in maintaining one's original culture while having daily interactions with other groups. And finally, the marginalization strategy is defined by little possibility or lack of interest in cultural maintenance and little interest in having relations with others. The strategies are, however, not static in themselves. At times, they seem to overlap. When the acculturative preferences or strategies are forced by the dominant group, assimilation would be termed as melting pot. Separation would be called segregation, marginalization as exclusion, and integration as multiculturalism. Only when the dominant society is all embracing towards cultural diversity, the preference for integration strategies can be independently pursued by the individuals of the non-dominant groups. This brings to the end of our discussion on acculturation. In today's globalized world, sociocultural intermixing and exchanges among the various groups all over the globe have become quite a common phenomenon. Throughout the process of acculturation, individuals and groups engage in cultural contacts, exchanges, and intermixing. These sociocultural associations may produce a potential consensus for conflict among the members of the dominant group and the members of the acculturating or the lesser dominant groups, as well as the need for negotiation that would result in implications adaptive for both the groups. Such diversity is an accepted feature of the contemporary world. It has become imperative for all the people to find a positive way to accommodate each other in this globalized world. Thank you.